That's the huge problem, right? Is this disconnect, I usually say, between people above and below the algorithm. Those who are inside the company, in Facebook's case, maybe 100,000 people inside the company. Very few people actually understand, even inside the company, the problems we discussed, right? But it affects people worldwide. And it's such a tight ship that no information goes out, or very little. And so it's a real problem of governance, is to understand from the outside what should be done about those situations.
That's Paul-Olivier Dehaye talking about Facebook. Up next on the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back, or welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. My name is Ben Catania. I'm your host. This is my show, which is all about risk and uncertainty. And if you've been here before, you know that I have long-form conversations with risk takers, with people who embrace uncertainty, as well as conversations with some of the most interesting and fascinating people on this planet about some of the most important risks and uncertainties of our times, so-called big picture conversations. And today's episode is one of those. So let's get into it. Today's episode is a fascinating look at technology, data protection, privacy, social media, accountability, and so much more. My guest is Paul-Olivier Dehaye. Paul is a Swiss-based mathematician who, amongst other things, helped blow the lid on the Cambridge Analytica scandal. He's a Belgian based in Switzerland and has done extensive research on how social media platforms predict our behavior and create dangerous amplification patterns. And if you've seen the highly acclaimed Netflix documentary, The Great Hack, you will have come across Paul. And if you haven't seen that documentary, I urge you to do so. Highly recommended. Paul was instrumental in helping one of that documentary's protagonists, New York media professor David Carroll, try to obtain the data that Cambridge Analytica had on him. Paul-Olivier was the man to do this because well before the 2016 US elections and the Brexit referendum in the UK, he had been looking at Cambridge Analytica and looking at these issues for some time. He was looking at how Cambridge Analytica was openly violating the EU's data protection rules. He has subsequently provided testimony to the UK Parliament on the issue. Paul has been looking at how data is traded and handled, particularly by Facebook, but also by Uber, by Tinder, and other social platforms. He's the founder of personaldata.io, which is a nonprofit that promotes digital rights and trust in the digital world, and it aims to help people control their digital identity. And we get into all of that in this amazing conversation that covers social media and behavior prediction, how amplification patterns work, how Cambridge Analytica first came onto Paul's radar, how he researched the firm, what he found. And again, this is before the Brexit referendum and Trump election. And we talk a lot about Facebook and what that company is doing and isn't doing in response to all of this, how it is shooting itself in the foot. And Paul focuses a lot on Facebook because, well, Facebook has and continues to change the social dynamics around us and around the world. But he has also focused on, and we also talk about other platforms such as Uber and Tinder. We discuss the physics of social media and how we don't really understand how it all works fully. Paul shares some solutions he sees and why a lot of these lie with individuals and their rights to access the data that companies have on them. We discuss Paul's nonprofit personaldata.io and so much more. I am sure that you are going to find this one absolutely fascinating. So let's get into it. Here is Paul-Olivier Dehaye. Welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be very interesting and insightful.
Thank you.
So to position yourself with my audience. You are the founder of something called personaldata.io. You've taken a very active interest in all things privacy and data. And I'd love to get a little bit of who you are and a bit of your background so that my audience can position you.
Sure. So I'm 37. I'm from Belgium, but I live in Geneva. And by training, I'm a mathematician. So I was in an academic career in mathematics for a long time. And then at some point, this hobby, this interest of mine on the side in data protection sort of became really more than just a hobby. And I started working in that field and, yes, setting up a nonprofit, Personal.io, to work on those issues.
Okay. How did you get interested in this topic of data? What sparked it, and what started this exploration and that led to this entire sort of transformation in terms of what it is that you do? Where did it start?
Well, I think in retrospect, the story I build is that I've always been interested in information and secrets and the ability to maintain secrets. So that's probably partly why when I had to choose which field of mathematics to work in, I started working in number theory, which is very close to cryptography. So there was already some of that interest. But I guess around 2010 up to 2015 or so, my awareness started increasing of the impact of personal data collection and algorithms on shaping the world around us. And I thought that was very interesting, but also potentially problematic in terms of our liberties or freedoms and our autonomy as individuals. And so I started questioning whether this was a sensible direction to go in, and whether we shouldn't maybe first discuss it. Let's say have a broad debate about this direction. Of course, it has been going on for much longer, and many people have been working on this space before. That was the origin of my interest.
And so these were how data was being collected by the internet, via social media. What specific things were you noticing that started to worry you?
Well, of course, there were the Snowden revelations that were part of this understanding suddenly that, yes, we had cryptography, yes, we had all of those techniques that on paper look very good, but once we started implementing it, we realized that, well, with the Snowden revelations, that actually there are a lot of steps before you have a concrete implementation of those techniques. And that's where different layers of problems get introduced. And so that was the state surveillance angle, but maybe more worrying was the corporate surveillance angle. This fact that all this data about us is quite predictive of a lot of information and very revealing about ourselves and our patterns of thinking. And most people don't know this, of course. At the time, almost no one knew. And I think that's quite concerning. I mean, a friend of mine, Frederica Kaltoner of Privacy International, she says those systems, when they work very well, can turn Orwellian, and when they don't work, they turn Kafkaesque, right? So it's this dual outcome that we should be concerned about.
And were you starting to notice, or were you starting to get involved with the governance of data? The reason I ask is it seems like to me, and I've had other guests that have talked about this, that the pace of technological change has gone much faster than what our governance systems, institutions, etc., have been able to keep up with. And
so there's two questions there. I think there's the question of governance of data. What are the proper setups? And then there is the oversight and the discussion over technological developments. And for the second part, that was the most concerning to me for a while, was that I'm a quite technical person, so I was quite aware, and I'm quite ready to read in other disciplines than mine. So I was quite aware of the technology and what it allowed to do. For instance, profiling people on psychometrics and stuff like that. And people around me had no awareness of it, despite having, a very high level of education and a very high level of technical understanding. But for instance, my mathematician colleagues just had no awareness of any of this, of any of the business dynamics surrounding this, and the long-term impacts of those systems.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain what psychometrics is for my listeners that might be new to the term?
Yeah, so psychometrics is the ability to measure an individual's main psychological dimensions. So in a very quantitative way. Psychologists over the past 20 to 30 years have built, in a very, very interesting way, some kind of scales to measure those main characteristics of people's psychology. And they've calibrated questionnaires in order to assess those dimensions. And so that was existing for a while, and it's not like it's an absolute measurement, and it's not contested. There are lots of criticism over those techniques. But what happened around 2012, 2013, and I read the papers at the time, was that there were scientific publications coming out of Cambridge University explaining that you could just dump those questionnaires and you could just instead use social media traces. Facebook likes were as revealing as those questionnaires, as revealing as, so provided as much insight as a spouse or a friend could have into a person. And this could all be quantified quite easily.
Wow. So when you say how much insight a spouse or a friend could have on a person, that's shocking.
Yeah, it is shocking. And lots of people react very strongly to this proposition. So they will say that, they have free will and a computer will never be able to predict them, etc. But that's why it's really interesting to actually understand how these measurements were produced in the first place. Like, what does it mean that an individual would have 5 main dimensions to their psychology? And the way psychologists did it is really interesting. They relied on basically human evolution to do this, because what they did is they went around and asked people. So if they have a target, let's say an individual that is a target to evaluate psychologically, they'll go around and ask their friends, how would you describe this target? How would you describe your friend? And they would encourage them to use multiple adjectives. And then they would see correlations between the adjectives for different targets. So which words appear very often together. And thanks to that, they started seeing correlations. And it's actually those main correlations are the main 5 dimensions that they've identified in this ocean scale.
Right.
So it's really interesting, because it's not by measuring deeply into your brain or asking you questions even, is by asking your friends to provide adjectives to qualify the person, which makes it rely on what they perceive as important, which obviously itself relies on years of evolution for us to be able to sense those things from each other.
Right. So these are these scales like openness and conscientiousness and extraversion, right? Agreeableness and neuroticism, I think, is the last one.
Right, neuroticism. These are the main 5 characteristics, that 5 dimensions that they've identified. As I said, it's quite contested. Maybe some other dimensions, which are not necessarily the next 3, but there are 3 other dimensions that are quite interesting to me as well, even in the context of fake news and all those things. One is the need for cognition, the need for affect, and the locus of control. So the locus of control is how much agency do you place in yourself or in individuals to actually change their life. Like, do you believe in destiny, or do you actually believe that individuals, can decide for themselves?
Okay.
So that's one dimension. And obviously will affect how you make decisions about yourself and about others. And the other 2, so need for cognition is when you take a decision, how much do you need to think about the decision? Right? So do you need to ponder this for a while, or are you maybe more of an emotional person? You need to have an emotional connection to the decision you're taking. And that's the need for affect. And the 2 are not necessarily opposite, right? You could have both needs, or you could have none of those needs. But obviously, the need for cognition, if you're able to find people who don't need to think but are highly emotionally sensitive to, that's what they need to feel emotions to react, then you can influence them in certain ways that the opposite, quote unquote, people, you will not be able to.
Mm-hmm. And so when social media started to become a much more mainstream thing, for many people, inadvertently, through likes and behavior on social media, what you're saying is it becomes very easy to approximate one's personality based on those categories. Yeah, and not just personalities, but also behaviors. Okay, right.
So the personalities is one input, and it's not perfect. And at the moment, it's giving you these scores, but social media allows you to also measure how people react, right? Whether if you submit some kind of stimulus, how do they react? Do they like it? Do they share it? Do they comment on it? And as a consequence, you can improve your models over time. You can refine these things, and there are gigantic feedback loops all over the place that make those systems improve over time. And there are also business dynamics surrounding this. So that a lot less people are aware of what their impact might be in terms of algorithmic amplification of messages. But on social media, there is usually a system of bids between advertisers, but also between advertisers and organic content, because it's some kind of measurement of the short-term revenue for the platform and the longer-term impact of maintaining you just another post longer on the platform, right? So that means that some content might be shown to you, even though it was paid for originally. The platform will decide to show it to you for free because you're actually engaging with it, right? So that means that there are potential amplification patterns that would result from the platform thinking, oh, this is an ad, and this is actually highly desirable content because people engage with it, and you don't need to beat. So this is the part I cannot quantify, but you don't need to be perfect in your targeting. You just need to do better, a tiny bit better than other such content in order to have real effect, because it's all going to be amplified by the platforms. So when you combine all of this, you actually have these systems that are not about targeting optimally or this and that, but they're more about causing virality, really. So it's not about persuading someone, but it's more about spreading a message in a very viral way. The analogy I have in my head is some kind of brush fires, where you can go into a field of some kind of cereals, and you can try to start a fire, and in some places it will spread in certain ways or others, but you get to try again afterwards, right? You get to try again and again and again, and the field doesn't change, but every time you learn how it propagates. So at the end, you can just be very, very much more precise in how you light it up, and hope that it actually spreads far and wide.
Okay, I think that makes sense the way you explain it. Now, was this work what Alexander Cogan was doing?
So what Cogan was doing was replicating things that had been done before from a scientific standpoint. So he took those 2012, 2013 papers, so which have been read by Cogan, by Bannon, by Christopher Wiley, so quite a lot of people in that space, and myself. And he tried to replicate this study, but at some point, access to Facebook data became a problem. And so on top of replicating this scientific study, he also started using his apps that were originally developed for Cambridge University. So he repurposed them for this private company of his that was just there to scrape data, basically.
Right. And this is the data that he sold to Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, so this is the data that went on to Cambridge Analytica. Now, the exact conditions of the exchange, I don't exactly know all the details or whether I would qualify as a sale, but yes, that's the data that was eventually used for a while by Cambridge Analytica.
Right. Could you share with us some of the questions you were asking at the time around some of these practices, questions of Facebook and companies like Cambridge Analytica, and what information were you trying to gather and How was that met? What were you finding?
So what happened at the time, I was living in Zurich, and I knew a journalist from. So I had sort of closed the idea of my academic career for a different reason that is related to this whole personal data thing, and then I saw an article about Cambridge Analytica, and I was really interested in this situation, because you had a European company that was profiling hundreds of millions of Americans and boasting about it. So they were basically violating all data protection rules in Europe and just broadcasting this. And so I thought this was a huge opportunity for Americans to learn about data rights that we have in Europe, even though they're not enforced. And so I started working with this journalist in Zurich, and Hannes Grasegger, and explaining why I thought this was interesting, and eventually what convinced him that this was indeed worth doing, and not just what Obama was doing, worth covering, was the fact that this company was really working in just a couple of years before, or even concurrently, in PSYOPs, so in information operations on behalf of nation states in the context of military operations. And so this was this complete, sudden confusion of, a military contractor being used by political campaigns domestically, quote unquote. And so that was the basis for him starting to work together on this big article. Now, I'm answering your question on what I started asking the companies with this long-winded introduction, because that introduction lasted several months. It lasted from basically February 2016 all the way to December 2016. So as we were doing all this investigation, Brexit happened, and then the Trump election happened. And we were watching live everything we could. We were trying to understand everything. And during the whole time, this journalist, Hannes, was asking me, how do you prove that it works? Which is, of course, the big question that remains now on many people's, on a lot of people's mind. And my answer was, we can't from the outside, right? It's impossible to do at the moment from the outside, because the platforms have all the data, or the political campaigns have all the data, and we have none. And even if we manage to get some by scraping, we'll never know what biases we introduce in the data when we scrape, and we'll never know what are the causes for the data we see, whether it's the campaigns or whether it's the amplification by the platforms, right? So there's several layers of intermediaries, and it's very hard to attribute a cause to the results you see. But I told him, there is a legal way where individuals can make demands to see their own data. And this opens a path towards getting more insights into how this whole thing works. And that path is what's called the subject access request, so a request for your own personal data. So this is something, let's simplify, this is something European residents can do, right? So they can go to any private company or even any state and say, I would like to see what data you have about me, what personal data you have. So it's not just the US concept of personally identifiable information. It's much broader. It's any data about the person, any profile that has been built, anything like it. And so I started doing this mostly with respect to, so I wanted to do this during this whole investigation, and Hannes was telling me, don't do it now, because if you do it, you'll tip them off that we're investigating, right? So it was those two competing approaches. And so I didn't do anything for a while, but then when the article came out in December, right away, I started asking the platforms for more information. So with Facebook, I asked for many things, but then I focused on two. The first one was, which audiences have I been put in by Facebook clients? So you have to understand a little bit how it works. When advertisers want to advertise on Facebook, they don't advertise to an individual. They are advertised to an audience. And an audience is just a set of individuals. So the advertiser uploads a bunch of contact information, like a bunch of emails or phone numbers and so on, and declares to Facebook, I got the consent from all of the people attached to those identifiers to target them on Facebook. Please build an audience from this. And Facebook will respond saying, okay, we matched like 70% of the profiles. And that's it, right? So now you have an audience, a small audience that you can advertise to. And my argument was, well, okay, from this process, Facebook is learning something. Facebook is learning that I've given my consent to that advertiser. So I would like all this information that Facebook has collected about me, all those advertisers that have obtained my consent, at least according to them. So I asked for this, and it took a few months, but eventually I did get it. And actually, even better, Facebook changed their transparency systems. So all of their 2 billion users can go and see that information for themselves now. And, people say, well, that's great, but, it doesn't change anything. But actually, I think it does, because the main impact it has is that journalists now have a direct route to explaining how much data Facebook has about people that they haven't given themselves, right? So it's revealing about the other side of Facebook, the commercial side. And journalists are able to say, and this has happened in their lead, in New York Times articles, when I went and looked at my Facebook data, I saw that 500 advertisers that I had never heard of had uploaded my contact information. And you can do the same. You can go over there and see it for yourself as well, right? So it's in putting this in front of people is quite impactful in my view. So that was the first thing I asked. And the second thing I asked was all of my browsing history as collected over the course of something like 10 years by Facebook. So ever since the introduction of this tool called Facebook Pixel, which is a little tag that is introduced on, some double-digit percentage of web pages on the web, that basically tracks you everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but, a significant share of the web. And Facebook collects all of this, right? And the response I got there eventually was that it would be too expensive to provide this data to me. So it wasn't like that I don't have rights to it. Actually, they almost acknowledged I had rights to it. But it was that it would be basically their systems are not engineered for that, and it would be too expensive to provide it, which is, I think, also important for a few reasons. So the first one is when Zuckerberg went to Congress and he was asked, if someone uses that tool, do they see everything you have about them? He replied yes. And in the follow-up written questions, that answer was directly challenged by a senator, Senator Warner, contradicting Zuckerberg based on my testimony to the UK Parliament that this data was not accessible to me. And as a consequence, I think it was a direct consequence, Facebook announced that they would implement this tool, which they sort of bastardized from the start by calling it Clear History, where you would be able to delete your history but not download it. And then it took a year to implement, and now it seems to be implemented in 3 countries and to be called something else and not Clear History. So they weakened it many times over before releasing it.
I suppose the algorithms in Facebook, I mean, if you're an advertiser and let's say you want to start a business, a yoga studio in some city, then anyone who's done a Facebook ad can create an audience, right? People that like yoga in a certain vicinity, etc. And then you can target your ads to a specific audience, and so that's valuable. Where I start to struggle a little bit with Facebook, and I'd be keen to get your thoughts, is surely somebody in the organization would have asked themselves that, okay, if this information is useful to somebody marketing a product to someone, surely it would be useful to people who have political purposes.
Well, yes. I mean, they're directly advertising to politicians to use the platform. They're directly building tools to entice politicians to use the platform. Through technology, they are making themselves indispensable in the electoral process. So yes, they are very aware of the use of data for this. And one could argue that in European law, this is not appropriate, because political data or uses of data for political purposes is sensitive, which requires higher level of consent, at least in some countries. And some of the tools, like lookalike audiences, that's one of the Facebook tools, imply basically profiling of everyone at every time for that particular use of the tool of lookalike audience. So if a lookalike audience is basically telling Facebook, here's a seed audience, here is like 1,000 people, and I would like you to construct from this seed of 1,000 people to find 10,000 people like them, right? And I'm a politician, and I would like to target those 10,000 people with this political ad. Now, in a way, one way to see what this politician is doing is that they are outsourcing the profiling for political purposes to Facebook, and implicitly, the entire user base of Facebook is profiled for political purposes to decide whether to put them or not in this expanded audience. And that requires, theoretically, consent from everyone involved. Now, of course, it's impossible, but then so be it. It might be impossible for very valid reasons. Maybe that tool is not appropriate to use in political campaigns. And actually, I think it's not, because for your audience, I think it increases drastically a lot of the risks associated with disinformation. It's a way for messages to spread in ways we don't understand, because it's highly dependent on proprietary algorithms and highly dependent on input data that we have no awareness of. And it's also highly vulnerable to adversarial data that is introduced in those systems. So let me try to explain it. Let's say I'm a bad actor and I'm not even a candidate, I support candidate B to be elected, right? And it's A against B, and I'm an external actor and I want B to win. So what I will do maybe is I will create a lot of pages with some of my content that is discouraging people who like A to vote, something like that, right? And I will look at what is going on A's side, right? So what happens when A posts stuff? Who reacts to it? What type of profile do those people have? And what I will do is I'll create sock puppets, so fake accounts, replicating the main characteristics of people who react to those posts. And I will do that. I will follow the same pages. I will make my fake accounts look very much like the real thing, the real supporter for A. But then I will also follow my organic pages, right? So I suspect that you don't need that many. So because it's so niche, you see, because it's such a specific set of characteristics, you don't need to have that many fake accounts to actually start having a real influence on the algorithms and the way its recommendation system works. And so as a consequence, the algorithms will start recommending my fake pages or the pages that I control, where I can push content much more easily myself, right? So you can seed bad data, adversarial data to the algorithms to leverage that massive power that's concentrated there to help your own goals. Right.
And if we talk about both the 2016 US elections and the Brexit campaign, for me, the question comes up, well, did these techniques influence the result? And watching the Great Hack, which you had you had a role to play in that very interesting documentary, it's clear that you don't need to influence a huge amount of people to swing a very close vote like the 2016 US elections or the Brexit vote. A small number of key stakeholders, of voters, constituents, it can obviously have a profound effect. And if you can target them specifically, then that's hugely powerful.
Yeah, but I think there are several steps here, and some of them we should not ignore. So
okay.
I know this because I was really following the campaign as it went along, and if you remember at the time you tried to reproject yourself, the media was just completely lost to cover the Trump election, or even the Brexit case. It was very lost, not just to cover the election, but to understand the media dynamics at the time. It just couldn't make sense of why some posts were getting so much share, right, more than the mainstream media, more than the main journalistic outlets, and so it couldn't make sense of that, and it affected coverage because editors at newspapers started telling their reporters to cover some of those topics because they were getting so much traction on social media, right? So this is already a real impact, is the fact that social media, those posts were getting so many shares. Well, that had an effect on how the election was covered. We were not talking about other issues, but we were talking about, debunking conspiracy theories or whatever stuff was going on at the time. So I think that causal link is pretty strong, that the conspiracy theories were the high sharing of content that was quite questionable was happening, and this was influencing coverage. And I think this influence on coverage definitely had an impact on the elections. So the real question is whether this targeting can actually have an effect on the spread of information on social media. And I think it can. This is an entire field of digital marketing, growth hacking, whatever you want to call it. How do you get something viral? The main difference is that people don't seem to grasp the consequence of it. So ask yourself, when is the last time you shared with your friends a toothpaste ad? You probably have never done it.
No.
But you might have shared political content.
Sure.
Right? So the amount of leverage, the amount of persuasion you need to have to encourage someone to reshare political content on social media is much, much, much lower than any other content, probably.
Right.
And we don't exactly know how that works, how the psychology of it works. We don't exactly know. But we know that every 4 years, if you look at the US, there's this massive stress test on platforms algorithms, the dampening on those algorithms, the detection of problems. There are massive stress tests because we suddenly have highly engaging content and a lot of money thrown behind it. And it's unprecedented from election to election. And we just don't know how platforms deal with that. And in 2016, they certainly were not prepared. But we could see some signs beforehand that there might have been problems there. And I see three signs. What happened with listicles, with clickbait, and with the ice bucket challenge.
Okay.
So they don't exactly have the same dynamics behind, but basically at some point the algorithm thought, well, everyone wants to see clickbait. Let's just show clickbait to everyone. Right? So the feed was overrun, the news feed was overrun with that type of content because the algorithm could detect that something was clickbait because of the way the headline was written or whatever it was, and people clicked on it. So sure, I'll show you more of that. And as a result, everyone saw it. Same thing with listicles, like 7 things you will never believe about so-and-so, right? So that happened. But my point is that this required manual correction, manual input from engineers who went in and, found out why this was happening and corrected it. And the other thing was the ice bucket challenge, which, this challenge to friends to throw a bucket of water on top of yourself. But that probably, so first of all, in the conception of the thing from the start, it had the viral effect, but also it was using video at a time where Facebook was encouraging to use video.
Mm-hmm.
So that also helped promote it in the feed. Right. So again, this sort of overwhelmed the algorithms for a little while and just affected the content that everyone would see.
Right. And I guess it's kind of an exponential growth thing where the more it gets shared, the more it's shared, the more it gets shared. And there's only so many things in your feed that you can focus on. So the amount of clicks and shares of certain type of content to other content is, the difference is massive, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's another step in there that I don't think you've made explicit. It's the less it gets filtered, right? So there's only so much space. There's only so much space in your feed. If you think that on Facebook you see everything that your friends post and everything,
right.
That's not true.
Right.
There is a high filter being exercised there, and that's maybe where there is the most impact. Is Facebook has to decide which content to show you. And if suddenly there is ice bucket challenges being shared here and there everywhere, and this is the only thing that gets through among a lot of other content, right? Then from your perspective, it looks like that's all there that is circulating on the feed. That is all that is circulating on Facebook.
Right.
But it's far from the truth. But it's just what Facebook filters or doesn't.
And it feels like that's what's going on in the world, is just the ice bucket challenge, or that's the majority of what's going on in the world. And of course, what Facebook is trying to do is just get you back spending as much time on that platform as possible. Yes.
So we generate as much revenue, of course.
Yeah.
Person per person, and this is a combination of maintaining you on the platform, showing you content that they get paid for, so ads in other words, and not too much, because of course if they show you too much, you'll leave, right? So it's this, they have to optimize for this right balance. It's a bit like those sitcoms where it's interrupted every 9 minutes for an ad, that's fine. If it's interrupted every 3 minutes for an ad, then you just give up and you go do something else. Well, they can optimize for this very, very much. They can measure every single item on your newsfeed is based on this calculation, basically.
Mm-hmm. And let's go back to the non-filtered part, because that's where you get into fake news, and it's amazing what things get shared that are totally don't have much basis or any basis in fact, and even just a little modicum of critical thinking on something that's political, and you might think, why in the world do people believe this? but it's interesting that
but it's actually I mean, there is definitely an element of, yes, this content is ludicrous, why do people believe it? Mm-hmm. But you cannot overlook the filter either. Mm-hmm. I mean, for something that appears ludicrous to you and that someone gullible will immediately accept, there is a whole bunch of people in between that are like, oh, that's odd.
Right.
That's really odd. Wait a minute. I don't believe it, but I'll read it.
Right.
So they will click on this, right? They will look at it and they will engage with that content. And maybe afterwards they will comment and say, well, this is completely crap, or whatever they want to say, right? And it could very well be that this is all perceived as great. People engage on the platform. Wow, we managed to get them more here. So we're at a stage where information circulates with rules, with physics that we don't fully know, because it's controlled entirely by the platform. And the physics is not quite the same for all of us, but it's kind of contagious, right? So it gets very complicated to understand the dynamics, and our relation to information is going to be different for all of us, but we have to account for it in order to really know ourselves, how we stand. It's a bit like a contagious disease, right? And vaccines. Like you're never quite sure whether your vaccine has expired or not. and you're never quite sure that people around you have been vaccinated in the first place, or how the vaccination actually was. But there is definitely contagion effects. So that's the situation right now.
Right. How in your estimation has Facebook been responding to all of this, and whether or not that's satisfactory?
I think they've been shooting themselves in the right foot, then the left foot.
Okay.
Then they had to look for another foot to shoot in, because they just keep on making mistakes. I mean, they are set in one business model, of course. It's a big ship and everything. And they're resisting so many calls for transparency that are just going to bite them back very, very heavily. And I think it's really stupid. I mean, they could just own it. They could just own what they were doing and say, okay, this is how it works. This is what we have. And these are the dynamics we're observing of influence on the platform and everything. But they're not in that mode, really. There's probably people inside that want to do that. But there is also a huge amount of corporate layer, of PR, of legal, and so on, that's preventing them from doing this. And in the end, that's hurting the company as well. That's hurting the image of the company.
Right. Let's get into that just a little bit. So you think it stems from wanting to protect the intellectual property associated with their algorithms and techniques? Is that what you would hypothesize?
Maybe, but I think it's just it stems from a disconnect.
Okay.
Just from a disconnect, like they don't understand from their vantage point. They don't understand that they need help from outside. They don't understand that this help could actually be beneficial, and they will never be able to do the same thing because they are in, if you are in such position of absolute power, as soon as something goes wrong, it's your fault. But if you share some of that power, if you try to distribute it wisely, then you're collectively responsible, or collectively there is some form of solidarity, right? So to be concrete, I mean, if Facebook was being more transparent in ways that could help journalists detect disinformation patterns or use of targeting for nefarious purposes and all of those things, sure, it might be uncomfortable for some of their clients, but mostly the bad clients, mostly the bad actors. And that's basically pure costs on their side that they've externalized to journalists, and that in doing so, they've acted, in the responsible way. Instead, they're closing up from everywhere, and, well, implicitly, they are assuming all the responsibility. And it keeps on blowing up in their face. I mean, because they are ultimately, there are a few tens of thousands of people, very smart for sure, but on the other side, there is a huge amount of people who try to influence how the platform works, because that's where you can make money. And it's going to be very subtle, because it's going to be highly culturally dependent. How do you con someone from Djibouti, right? I have no clue, but people in Djibouti now know. And I know that no Facebook engineer knows, right? So we're in those tricky situations. How are you going to prevent that? But it could have a real impact for populations there, and they'll get bad press eventually from this situation occurring all over the world again and again and again. So that's the situation they put themselves in.
And the risks that they face are regulatory interventions of a very, severe nature for them, or perhaps you get people leaving the platform.
I think you'd get people leaving the company. That's worse.
Okay.
That's worse. I mean, bad press and just working on, a product that hasn't evolved in 10 years, all that much. I mean, it's sure there are challenges, but the challenges are in fixing a broken business model and a product that has that is a kludge of features on top of features.
Right.
It doesn't sound all that exciting when you see it that way. And I think, college graduates they understand this.
Right.
They'll prefer to go elsewhere. And at some point, talent becomes a real problem, right?
Right. And who knows, something else might come along. Okay, could we talk about personaldata.io and what the rationale was, what the vision is for that organization, why you founded it?
Yeah, so basically at some point I realized that this mean of action was actually quite effective for people to understand the digital landscape better.
Mm-hmm.
So the mode of action was to actually request your data using those rights and sharing what was learned from it with journalists or with educators, with academics. In general, like being sort of a guinea pig, a test subject for civil society to appropriate the questions.
Okay.
Right? So if you're able to show what data is known about you, then a whole bunch of other actors can start talking about this situation and learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I wanted to do. And of course, I didn't want me to be the test subject for everyone else, but rather to build the systems that allow anyone to become a test subject in their own community, to actually be, this champion of understanding the digital world around them, with assistance from experts and amplification from journalists and so on and so on. So that's what I'm trying to do now.
Mm-hmm. So you focused on individuals or organizations around getting or helping them to get access to their data. How many or what response have you noticed since founding the organization?
So I'm focused on helping individuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
So helping individuals access their data and then interact maybe with organizations to amplify their findings. So the metrics are not that useful because at first I started by building a system that allowed anyone to make such requests very easily.
Right.
And they would file the request, and I got like a few thousands filed, helped a bunch of people. But the problem is that afterwards, I couldn't help them the help was not sustainable. I couldn't assist those thousands of people in the long run, right? So instead, now I'm focusing much more on building use cases, building examples where one or a few individuals get together and make those requests, but then they have a whole ecosystem around them to help them make the request as effective as possible, as impactful as possible, and these learnings to be amplified, etc., etc. So to really change the way some people do their work, basically. And like, for instance, journalists reporting on digital issues. So and I changed that strategy because that scales much better from my point of view.
Okay. And
also because I could see that already had an impact. So I helped a journalist get her data from Tinder, for instance, and then she wrote an article about it. So writing about her sex life as perceived by the Tinder database.
Oh, wow.
and so she's not necessarily, or she was not at the time necessarily a techie, but she wrote it in such a way that, is simultaneously titillating because of course it's about her sex life, but it's also encourages people to think about, like, she thinks about the positive that could come from this data, but also the negative. And the way she writes it, she implicitly encourages the reader to do so as well for their own interactions. So it's a very educational piece in a way. Another person I helped is David Carroll with get her data from Cambridge Analytica. So this has now become, a Netflix documentary.
Yes.
How great, right? So, which is very helpful for explaining this procedure to people, because they can put themselves in David's shoes and understand much better what is going on, or what their means of actions are. Another person that I helped is someone called James Farrar, from in London, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So he's an Uber driver, and he's actually the first Uber driver who sued Uber for employment issues.
Okay.
I think. Okay. So he's the one with a few others who has won. He's won again and again against Uber for employment law issues on the status of Uber drivers. And at some point, he realized that his personal data and his rights around personal data could be helpful for his cause. And so that's when I came in and helped him get more data and analyze it and better understand a whole bunch of things, basically. How the Uber algorithm functions, or that's what we're trying to understand, how it dispatches rides, what impact it might have on his revenue and on his costs, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm working on similar things in many European cities, including Geneva, where once I managed to bring this issue locally, things move quite a lot quicker, basically.
Mm-hmm. Do you get?
And I should say, James, because of his success in court, other Uber drivers have started following him, in the sense like follow his lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he has founded another thing called a chapter of a labor union in Britain. So the Independent Workers of Great Britain, I think that's the name of the union. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of this labor union 2.0 for gig workers, where he has over 1,000 drivers in that union. And so that's obviously suddenly quite a lot of power on the side of drivers to renegotiate at least how data is managed, and
Absolutely.
who should control it, and who should get the dividends from this data. So it's fascinating talking to Uber drivers, because they get it much more than anyone else, what society we're moving into, what algorithmic power represents, and what impact it has on them every day. And so it's in the Marxist sense kind of thing, it's about reappropriating the tool of production, owning your car, but also owning the data you produce by driving around the city, and maybe mutualizing it at some point, or maybe not, or maybe building products on top that are not in the same system as the ride dispatcher or the intermediary. So it's a whole renegotiation that will have to take place.
Could we talk about that a little bit more? You mentioned that term algorithmic society, and what these Uber drivers are, what they're getting, what they are understanding that perhaps many of us are simply not. Can we talk about what that specifically means?
Yeah. So I'll give you two examples. Mm-hmm. I call them myths, mm-hmm. not because they're false or not because they're true. I don't know, but because they are like plausible stories from mm-hmm. their vantage point. So the first one is that. So first you have to know that not all Uber drivers own their cars. Mm-hmm. There are Uber partners that rent cars to Uber drivers. So they're even more disconnected from their tools of production, right. Basically, right? And so there's the myth that the Uber drivers who lease the car or who rent the car have better luck, quote unquote luck, with the algorithm that those who own the cars, right? So the theory is that Uber knows who is paying a weekly fee to rent the car, and that fee goes to an Uber partner that helps Uber cement control over a city and all of that. And so that creates much more incentive for Uber to distribute rides to those drivers.
Okay.
While the drivers who own their car, their luxury car, who don't have that many options in some cities, who to drive for, which platform to drive for, right? Mm-hmm. So they are highly dependent on Uber, and they're indebted for their car. And by that time, Uber can just close the faucet and not give them rides anymore, not give them work. There are even suspicions that among drivers, I'm just relaying the suspicion, that it goes further than that, in the sense that drivers are actually encouraged to buy cars, but the suspicion is that they would be encouraged based on false information, basically, on perspectives of earnings that are disconnected from the truth.
Okay.
So they would do their calculation. Actually, yes, it costs me this much to rent the car, but if I bought it, with the credit and everything, I would make more money. So I should do it. But once they make the jump of buying a car and taking debt, then taking more debt, then they're completely dependent, and that's when things can go wrong. And that this would be almost intentional on Uber's part. I'm just relaying what they think.
Wow.
But I call this a myth because, frankly, knowing the technology, knowing all of this, well, it would be technically possible to do it, right? So Uber has all the information they need. They would need to actually do this. How do we know they are not doing it? And this has an impact on them, on their mental health, right? On everything. So that's the first one. And the other one, just to show you how it works, like how they think, is the fact that sometimes they wait for a while. In a small city like Geneva, you might wait for a while. They don't get rides for 30 minutes, an hour, and then it approaches the usual time where they stop working. So, okay, they go home. They start driving home. And that's exactly the moment where they get a ride at the other side of town.
Okay.
So some people, you tell them that too, and it's like, oh yeah, of course they do that. Of course that happens. It's proved. It's called Murphy's Law.
Yeah. Right.
Of course, but it could actually be intentional. Again, we don't know. The technology would allow. The technology puts them in such a situation that they could do this and not be detected.
So the technology is potentially making them paranoid.
Yes, well, it's not just the technology that's making them paranoid. It's the technology and the lack of transparency.
Right.
So meaning you can have more technology and resolve that problem.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's such a fascinating consideration, because I think we all have had those days and those moments. You have a bad day and you think somebody's out to get me, right? And it's just a series of coincidences or what have you. But I suppose what you're saying, and correct me if I'm not saying this correctly, but the solution to all of this is more transparency, so you can actually see what is happening and what isn't happening.
Well, actually, that's the first step in my view.
Okay.
And then once we have transparency, then we have a lot more brains thinking about the problems. Okay. How we could evaluate the problems and whether a second step is needed or not.
Okay. Right.
But to go back to like the analogy you were making, yes, some days things go wrong and everything, but if you flip a coin that day and the coin lands just on the sliver, like just doesn't fall either side, it will not shake your belief that you understand how physics works and this is just chance, right?
Right.
But with the analogy of the digital world having its own physics that is altered by others that you don't have control over, you don't have awareness, the rules change and you don't know this. If this type of situation happened, you just wouldn't know. You just wouldn't know what the cause is. You can build all kinds of scenarios in your head, and you don't know.
Right, and that's from whether it's a mental health perspective or variety of it's not good for us, is it?
No, I think it's Tom Watson, the second in command for the Labour Party in the UK. He commented that the mining industry destroyed the body of the workers, but now the gig economy is destroying their brains.
Right. Okay.
And that's actually, when you talk, I mean, it sounds extreme, but in truth, talking to quite a few drivers by now, they're asking themselves a lot of very valid questions, and it's very uncomfortable it's very uncomfortable getting a glimpse into all of those questions that I know we'll all be asking ourselves in the future, because they are the canary in the coal mine. That's what others are saying, right? So their work life is regimented by algorithms, and soon it's going to be all different aspects of our own lives that are going to be regimented like this, and optimized for profits in all kinds of ways, in sometimes competing ways, right? So different systems will interact, and we might be collateral in these fights, and we better quickly build accountability mechanism for all of this, because otherwise it's going to be very Kafkaesque and very, very problematic.
Well, so what should we be doing then, Paul, if we fast forward a bit to some of the things that whether you're doing as a part of personaldata.io, or what can individuals do? What are the types of things that we should be doing that are some of the solutions to this?
Well, so I'm of course doing personaldata.io, where I have a community of people that I hope to encourage to support those data champions, right? So it's the support team. I would encourage more people to behave like David Carroll and actually question the systems that make them uncomfortable.
Right.
Ask questions, rely on their rights. So I said earlier that you had to be a European resident. It's not quite true. You have to be using a system that is based in Europe, or you have to be living in Europe and maybe using a US-based system. So it's a complex interplay. So that's one option. The other one is another community I'm involved in. I'm on the board of the global community. It's called My Data, so MY Data, and that's very much about building communities locally that think about those issues. So they're not necessarily acting through access requests like I'm promoting with personaldata.io, but they're really about building local communities of very different stakeholders, whose composition is relevant to the local communities all over, thinking about this. So concretely, it means, a bunch of business people, a bunch of law people, a bunch of civil society people, a bunch of just citizens who care, who get together and learn about how to take back control over their own personal data, over their own agency, autonomy in this space. They learn together as relevant to their own context, right? It's not going to be the same in Japan as it is in Italy or whatever. So that's why we have those hubs all over the place. So with a bit of luck, there is one nearby your listeners, and otherwise, we're a community that wants to see more hubs. So maybe you'll want to start one at home.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be some people that are interested in that. If they are, what might great way to either connect to a local one or to learn how to start one? So
at mydata.org, that's the site for the association, the grouping. So you will see some information about where there are hubs currently, which cities or which countries we're present in. There will also be an announcement for a conference that's coming very soon, at the end, next week actually, in Helsinki, or a global conference every year, and a link to our Slack channel where you can go in and start asking more questions. So that's my data. And for personaldata.io, you can just go to forum.personaldata.io. And again, you'll see a forum there. And you're welcome to introduce yourself and maybe join.
Cool. Thanks for that. We've covered a fair bit of ground, and I am conscious of time. But before we go, I'd be keen to get further thoughts on where you think this is all all going, and what some of the, are you optimistic about optimistic, pessimistic, neutral? What do you think some of the other risks perhaps that we haven't discussed lie, or opportunities?
So I'm quite optimistic. I see a path where we actually as a society take back control over those systems and understand them better and make sure they serve us rather than cause problems, cause more problems. The path I see is that basically we reverse a mistake that was made years ago, which is this button where we click "I agree." Right. So that situation has led us to those buttons have led us to a situation where each of us has individual contracts with the 5 biggest companies in the world. And that's new. It wasn't the case when one of the biggest 5 companies in the world was ExxonMobil and, those oil companies. Now it's a Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and so on. And we each have a contract with them. And in clicking I agree and signing this contract, the most important thing that happened is not the rights that we signed away there, but it's the fact that there was no civil society. There was no civil society looking over your shoulder telling you, actually, this doesn't quite feel right, let me investigate. Or actually, let me tell you what's really going on so you understand and so we can make sure that you're making a sound decision. And so what needs to happen is for civil society to understand, so that means educators, journalists, academics, to understand how to inject themselves into that relation in a way that preserves privacy and preserves a whole bunch of other objectives. And that's actually quite hard because it requires a real shift of those practitioners in those fields. Consumer organizations or even NGOs, they tend to be policy shops. They tend to talk to governments to change law and everything. They don't necessarily talk to the individual to learn, to teach them how to be an activist, or how to enact change themselves, right? Academics, they tend to do studies on big data sets collected about massive amounts of people. They don't really engage, or it's a very small group that engages in citizen science and things like that, where they really involve the individuals, and so on and so on. So it requires a real shift from civil society, rather than looking up, to look down and to help individuals reappropriate this digital world. And I think legally in Europe, and it's being copied elsewhere, all the tools are there. The laws are there. They enable this.
Right.
So the question is whether they will be enforced and whether there is enough of a groundswell from civil society for the regulators to be almost forced to enforce it. Because that's the situation, that's the reality now. We have such regulatory capture in a way that the regulators sometimes need to be pushed to actually apply the law. And that will only come once they see, okay, that's the perspective. This right of access that is so obscure and everything, what's the point? Well, the point is that journalists start using it because it helps them inform the general public better. And the point is that citizens start exercising them because they understand that this can be effective to provide materials for journalists to understand those issues. And once regulators see that, then a sort of bandwagon will be launched, I view. But and the good businesses, the good investors, the good VCs, and so on, they'll see this and they'll start investing in the business solutions that take those things into account to actually, from the start, build better systems that do not rely on opacity and so on to make a profit.
Right. I think that there are some green shoots on all of these types of topics. At the same time, you've got China has a whole different way of governing the internet, right? So it will be very interesting to see how certain flashpoints play out. For example, what's happening in Hong Kong, for instance.
Sure, but the Chinese argument comes often as it's a battle between Europe and the US of ideas around how personal data should be regulated. And we better quickly decide, preferably the US way, because otherwise China will dictate its rule everywhere. Well, actually, there's also India. India has a very different conception of how data should be governed. Very progressive, in my view, maybe the most intelligent one. I mean, they say,
really?
This data affects how social policies can be implemented, how much sovereignty we have over the conception and deployment of new civil interventions. Like, let's say we want to promote women, we want to promote entrepreneurship in women, right? So data would help us take decisions and measure effects and so on, and just develop better policies. But we cannot do that if the data is held far away, and we barely have a hearing from big tech companies, or when we only do after a long time and so on. So we've lost our sovereignty if that data is over there. So their call in India is just, Indian data should be in India. It should be localized there. And the response is often, from a tech standpoint, that's stupid. And sure, but let's enter into a negotiation over control then over this data, right? The real question is who should decide what can be done with this data. And they're not arguing about, it's the biggest democracy in the world. They're not arguing about surveilling their citizens. They're arguing about preserving their autonomy and being able to develop policies that enable local entrepreneurs to seize the opportunities they see, and to build businesses that are respectful of local populations and so on, and not have a massive brain drain to the US and things like that, right? I think it's very progressive, and it's very hard to argue that that's not actually a very reasonable demand. And so it's going to be quite fascinating to see how this whole thing plays out. It's kind of a coincidence, but I'm based in Geneva, and I lived in Geneva before launching my nonprofit. But it's really the place where those things are starting to get decided now, where different countries get together and start really thinking about how to govern data, how to govern the web more effectively, because obviously it has failed so far.
Yeah, and that's encouraging, because as we started to talk about at the beginning of the conversation, it's the technology is moved at a quicker pace than the governance. So if there's some catching up, then obviously our laws and things become more aligned with the times and the society in which we live. Yes.
I mean, that's the huge problem, right? Is this disconnect, I usually say, between people above and below the algorithm. Those who are inside the company, in Facebook's case, maybe 100,000 people inside the company. Very few people actually understand, even inside the company, the problems we discussed, right? But it affects people worldwide. And it's such a tight ship that no information goes out, or very little. And so it's a real problem of governance, is to understand from the outside what should be done about those situations. And I think it's only through discussions between civil society actors, between states, to figure out. And actually, it's quite interesting, because the decisions ultimately will be political. So will be taken at the UN Assembly in New York or something like that. But it doesn't prevent us from building better solutions, each in our own neighborhoods, thinking through what that should look like, and basically bubble up the better practices. I think it's totally possible. And it can serve as examples to inform policy as well.
Yeah, fantastic. This has been fascinating, and we could probably keep going in a variety of areas, but this is probably a good place to wrap up. But before we do that, Paul, was there anything that you wanted to mention that you didn't feel like you got a chance to discuss?
No, I just want to say thank you for the conversation, because I also enjoyed it very much. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
But otherwise, no, I'm quite happy with the thing.
Before we go, where can people find you, connect with personaldata.io and other places where they could follow you and your work?
I spend too much time on Twitter, so okay. I'm at PODEHAYE. So my initials and my name. Otherwise, the organization also has an account there, personaldata.io. Also, the website personaldata.io, and my data is at mydata.org. So those are all the big places. And of course, you can find emails there, and you're welcome to contact me. And yeah, we can get chatting.
Fantastic. This was a pleasure. Thank you very, very much. All right, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. What did you think? How can we and you make data protection rights more useful? Give Paul-Olivier Dehaye a follow. Check out personaldata.io. Links are in the show notes as usual. Finally, before we go, two things. First, a reminder that our free module to our upcoming course, How to Make Impossible Decisions with Calm and Confidence, is live and available. And secondly, we'd love to hear from you about all things risk. Our listener survey is still live. I'd be grateful if you took about 3 minutes to complete it. Consider it an investment in helping us give you even better content. Links to both of those things are also in the show notes. That is it. We'll be back soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.